Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're doing something truly incredible. We are literally turning back the sands of time to unearth a breathtaking yet largely forgotten empire. Nestled way up high in the rugged, unforgiving mountains of southern Yemen, the kingdom of Qataban was an ancient powerhouse. This was a civilization that literally fueled the temples, the grand palaces, and the elaborate funeral rites of Rome, Egypt, and beyond. Through the archaeological evidence and ancient texts we're going to dig into today, we're going to piece together the epic story of a desert kingdom that completely mastered global trade, ingenious agriculture, and incredibly complex laws.
Imagine a world, long before modern borders were ever drawn. A world where endless stretches of sun-scorched desert were navigated by these massive, sprawling camel caravans. Well, thousands of years ago, Qataban emerged straight from this harsh crucible. They transformed themselves into a vital linchpin that connected the absolute greatest civilizations of the ancient world. And here's the thing, they didn't just survive in the desert, they completely thrived. They built a society of such immense wealth and cultural sophistication that, honestly, we are only just now beginning to fully understand it.
All right, let's jump straight into part 1, the Forgotten Incense Kingdom.
So to understand how this kingdom rose up out of the sand to become this absolute economic superpower, we first have to look at where it all began. It was centered around the Wadi Bayhan region. This was a surprisingly fertile valley right on the edge of the desert, and human settlement here actually dates all the way back to the Neolithic period. But if we trace the kingdom's timeline, we see a really remarkable arc. Qataban truly starts taking shape as its own distinct entity in the early 1st millennium BCE. Now, initially, it was just a vassal state, kind of living under the shadow of its much more powerful neighbor, Saba. But then, by the late 5th century BCE, Qataban successfully fought for and declared its independence. Fast forward into the 4th and 3rd centuries BCE, and we see Qataban hitting its golden age, reaching the absolute peak of its wealth and territorial expansion. But then, almost like a mystery, by the 2nd century CE, this magnificent kingdom just vanishes from the political map, completely absorbed by rising rival powers.
That brings us to part 2, Timna and the spice route.
You might be wondering, where did all the sheer wealth of Qataban actually come from? Well, it was driven by one massive, unstoppable economic engine, the incense route. And all of this was managed from their bustling, hyper-cosmopolitan capital city of Timna. Just think about the staggering scale of their global reach for a second. The Qatabanians completely controlled the flow of these incredibly prized commodities, primarily frankincense and myrrh. And we have to remember, these weren't just nice-smelling resins to ancient people. They were absolutely vital luxury goods. Ancient Egyptians literally required them for embalming, the Chinese prized them as essential medicine, and imperial courts from Rome all the way to the Parthian Empire burned them continuously in their religious rituals. So Qataban grew ridiculously wealthy by strategically taxing the thousands of camel caravans that transported these aromatics, along with exotic spices arriving from India across the ocean.
And all that staggering wealth? It paid for some seriously incredible urban development. When you look at the imposing ruins of Timna, you're looking at the pulsing, vibrant heart of the Qataban Kingdom. The famous Roman author Pliny the Elder actually wrote about this place, and he claimed the capital boasted an astonishing 65 temples. 65! But it wasn't just a religious center. It was the critical starting point for countless caravans gearing up for the long, totally grueling journey north toward Gaza, Petra, and eventually the Mediterranean Sea.
Even today, the foundations of these multi-story stone houses that surrounded the central market square just brilliantly illustrate how sophisticated their daily lives were. This market was a highly organized hub of commerce. Right smack in the center stood a huge granite obelisk, erected by King Shar Halal around 400 BCE. Now, this obelisk wasn't just there to look pretty. It meticulously detailed the commercial laws, the strict market regulations, and the exact taxes imposed on goods. It basically proves that this was a society of elite merchants operating under a rigorous, highly sophisticated legal framework.
Moving on to part 3, Masters of Desert Irrigation.
Here is a fundamental truth. You absolutely cannot sustain a massive kingdom in the arid mountains of Yemen purely on trade. At the end of the day, you have to feed your people. And this brings us to their, frankly, genius agricultural engineering. They practice something called seal, or flash flood irrigation. In an environment that gets barely any rainfall, sudden violent torrents of water rushing down the mountains were both a massive danger and an absolute lifeline. Now, instead of trying to build massive dams to just hoard this water, which, let's be honest, would quickly fill up with silt anyway, they designed a system to deflect the floodwaters straight from the wadi. They'd control the violent flow using these funnel-like masonry sluices and then rapidly disperse it into hundreds of small, manageable streams right over their fields.
As modern archaeologists have noted, the Qatabanian engineers were just incredibly precise. They custom-built these specific stone embankments and heavily wedged masonry walls right at the critical bends to resist the immense erosive power of the rushing water. They even designed these step-like drops to safely lower the water level from the main canals all the way down to the secondary distribution systems. And they did it all without washing away the precious, fertile earth.
So the crucial point here, and this is wild, is the sheer efficiency of this ancient method compared to modern attempts. Modern researchers point out that today, large floods in the region often just break right through our earthen dams, completely wasting the water into the desert. The Qatabanians, on the other hand, had this perfect knack for breaking down a dangerous, raging flood into harmless, uniform little streams. The destructive strength of the water was totally neutralized, and it ended up depositing this rich, beautiful silt perfectly evenly across their crops. It's a brilliant feat of environmental engineering, and honestly, it's largely considered a lost art today.
All right, let's look at part 4, Kings, Gods, and Society.
So beyond the physical infrastructure, the canals, the trade routes, what actually held this civilization together? How did the rulers, the society, and their deeply held beliefs function on a day-to-day basis? Well, at the very top of the social pyramid was the king. And at the absolute height of Qataban's power, the kings adopted the title Muqatab. Now that translates to unifier. And it wasn't just some vanity political title. It signified immense regional hegemony and deep religious authority over the area. The kingdom was essentially a very large tribal confederation, and the citizens proudly unified their identity under their religion. They actually referred to themselves not just as Qatabanians, but as the children of Am.
Which begs the question, who was Am? He was the moon god and the central patron deity of all of Qataban. Their polytheistic religion also revered Astar, who was the supreme world god, and Enbe, the god of justice, divination, and all legal matters. But what I find so fascinating here is their preference for the moon over the sun. Think about it. For the Qatabanians, participating in that grueling caravan trade meant relying super heavily on the cool night air and the stars for navigation across a deadly desert. Because of that, the moon was revered as this benevolent, guiding protector, while the blinding sun was viewed as a harsh, punishing force. It makes perfect sense when you consider their environment.
And we can see exactly how personal this religious devotion was through the texts they left behind. Take a look at this translation of a surviving Qatabanian inscription. It reads, "Dedicated Ahai, he committed to the protection of Anbe, his sons." This simple, ancient carving really humanizes the whole society for us. It literally shows a father actively seeking divine protection from the god of justice for his kids. It's a great reminder that behind all the grand temples and sweeping global trade networks, there were just everyday people navigating life, family, and faith.
Plus, these archaeological finds tell us that Qataban was a highly literate society. They used a very distinctive monumental script that they painstakingly carved right into the stone. When we look at pieces like this Sabaean inscription or a griffin carving from the neighboring capital of Shabwa, we get a perfect representation of the vibrant, deeply interconnected South Arabian cultural network that Qataban was woven into. They didn't exist in a bubble. They shared artistic styles, writing systems, and massive trade agreements with all the surrounding kingdoms. Which leads us to our final chapter, Part 5, Fall and Archaeological Rediscovery. The reality is every empire, no matter how ridiculously wealthy or well-engineered, eventually faces its decline. And by the 2nd century CE, the geopolitical landscape of South Arabia was rapidly changing. Qataban found itself getting squeezed. On one side, you had the resurgence of their old rival, Saba. On the other, the aggressive expansion of a brand new power, the Himyarite Tribal Confederation. On top of all that, international trade routes began to shift, favoring faster maritime paths over the traditional overland caravan routes that Qataban controlled. Stripped of its economic monopoly and its territorial independence, the kingdom of Qataban slowly, quietly vanished into the sands of time.
And for centuries, Qataban was entirely forgotten, literally lost to history. It wasn't until the 1950s that modern archaeology finally began to piece its remarkable story back together. Huge expeditions led by Wendell Phillips and the American Foundation for the Study of Man went out and excavated Timna, along with the nearby monumental cemetery of Hayd ibn Akil. Through the unearthing of those temples, the massive marketplaces, and thousands of stone inscriptions, they physically pulled Qataban right out of obscurity. They revealed its sophisticated laws and immense world-shaping wealth to the modern world. So I want to leave you with this final thought. The kingdom of Qataban may have vanished from the political map nearly 2,000 years ago, but its desert stones, they still speak volumes. They completely shattered the old misconception of the Arabian Peninsula as just some barren wasteland. Instead, they reveal a highly sophisticated, literate, and dynamic civilization that literally helped lay the foundations for the ancient global economy. So the next time you think of the great ancient empires of the world, make absolutely sure the forgotten kingdom of Qataban is on your list.